That's my absolute area of expertise.
In his book, David King maybe he's quoted inaccurately, but he's used 5 years, I think, to indicate the longevity of the particles, so you don't have to put it up there too often. It depends on which part. He said if you put it in the lower stratosphere, you're going to get turning around effect, so that the longevity of the particle won't last. So if you put it higher,
that's absolutely true. So it doesn't go linearly either, right? So Jim Hayward looked at this yesterday, right? So 10 kilometers is a much lower lifetime than 20 kilometers. So we see lots of volcanoes that the way the atmosphere is structured, right? You have a turbulent bit at the bottom, then you have a layered bit above it, and you have this barrier in between. And so as with thunderclouds, when you see volcanic eruptions, they often hit this thing and then spread out because they can't handle. Yeah, exactly. It's very hard to get up through the top of it. So we know that the lifetime of sulfur dioxide and subsequent lifetime of H2SO4 is much shorter in the troposphere than it is in the stratosphere.
Yeah, of course. But my point where I was trying to go was that the cooling extended so that when the warming happened at the end of the 90s, would that not be because there was a cooling from the volcano that lasted longer than just a few years? Because of the lifetime cycle of the particles in the upper stratosphere. So what I'm trying to say is there was cooling from Mount Pinatubo, and then at a later point in the 90s there was a warming, and that got everyone really concerned. Okay, and then following the 90s, there really hasn't been the same rate of warming. It's paused. Right. So the question is, was that warming at the end of the 90s just the Earth balancing from the cooling it had? From Mount Pinatubo, so basically
a bit like a rebound effect. So the answer to that, so I think the answer to that is no. And the reason you know that is because you can plot temperature over time, and you can plot a trend over the last 150 years. It's reasonably clear. Exactly. And so you can see these little tick marks that are, I might put it in my talk or something, you can see these little tick marks that are volcanological, and actually if you take those tick marks away, the trend's very clear. So it doesn't bounce in the way that you think it would.
In the 1990s in Australia, I was looking at the number of people that died from heat waves, and it's huge, thousands of people, and there are different examples of that. I'm looking for historical references to heat waves, and in the 1930s, according to the EPA, which is still up on their website, the 1930s was the hottest decade of the 20th century. Going on, their data sets is still on their website. So if the EPA are saying like the Hollywood, the dust bowls, all this, the 1930s was the hottest decade. That's what they are saying. It's what's on their website now. Still,
it might be driest rather than hottest.
Well, I searched. But so what I'm trying to say is, I know that 1890 seems to be quite hot, because there seems to be lots of references to that. Then you've got 1930s, and this is before the real effect of the CO2 would have really had an you could say, well, that's because of the CO2 from the Industrial Revolution.
That's a hard thing to make, because the CO2, if you look at the way temperature and CO2 have increased, it's really, the Industrial Revolution is the start of it, but actually it's really around about the 1950s when it starts to accelerate quickly. So
the CO2, but the temperature didn't at that point, did it?
So temperature and
CO2
CO2
were about the Arctic, a new ice age in the 70s.
So temperature and CO2,
there's a lag.
There's quite a strong lag.
According to the ice core samples from Bristol, it's 800 years.
Well, that number comes with a lot of slop. But that's
I'm looking at those correlations that Al Gore used, and some of the people have suggested that relationship that Al Gore used was incorrect, and that's why it's no longer in British schools on the curriculum, because there's
the lag
problem.
I think the lag is more complicated than people originally said.
Sure it is. I'm not doubting it. I'm trying to establish, since there's been a relative pause, where does that confirm that the CO2 is responsible for global warming? If the pause, why isn't it continuing?
I think the honest truth is that nature doesn't go in straight lines, right? So we're adding CO2, and that CO2 line is fairly consistent. But actually, if you look at nature, it does all sorts of strange things. There's various steps and various periods, and
adding to its confusion of how to understand it.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there's lots of confounding evidence, most of which I think is deliberately wrong, about how climate change behaves. And I don't have a super strong trust in models, so I make observations rather than models.
Geek out, so it's like the little phrase, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, exactly. So, but also, there's a lot made of the fact that lots of different models all say the same thing, and I know people, particularly mathematicians, that question that because all of the guts of the models are the same, so they're not statistically independent. But nevertheless, so I've only been in climate science for about 4 years, right? I was a volcanologist.
Really? Okay. No, in fact, I still am. That's my day job. Okay, which is great.
So I approached the whole climate thing reasonably sceptically. I mean, I'm naturally going to believe scientists because I am a scientist. But actually, I went into it in about 2010 thinking, right, I'm going to dig into this. And I found out very quickly there was absolutely no way that any of this stuff can be explained other than by CO2.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I convinced myself of that very, very quickly.
Now, David Keith and others have said that they want to get back to pre-industrial times. There's lots of references from the Royal Society.
But he's changed his mind.
Has he changed his mind?
He has changed his mind.
So what he's talking, well, but so
he knows that you can't get back exactly.
Yeah. So I wouldn't assume that because he talks about models that take us back to pre-industrial times hypothetically, that's what he wants. Actually, in his book, what he says he wants is to take the edge off, right? This idea of what's called peak shaving, where you just introduce enough geoengineering to slow the rate of increase enough, and you basically hold the temperature steadier now, or stop it going up so fast. So I don't. In fact, he's probably the strongest opponent of this idea of a pre-industrial reset.
Yeah, because the pre-industrial times was the end of the Little Ice Age, when the Thames would freeze over, and you'd have to question, well, would we not get natural variability and be warmer anyway following the Little Ice Age because we didn't continue in the Little Ice Age? I mean, that's their comment, isn't it? And the period before the Little Ice Age, the medieval warm period, that was about like 400 years or something, wasn't it? When the Vikings sailed across, and in the 10th century, mid-10th century, and they were in Greenland for 400 years, and they had no modern advantages, so they were able to, now what's permafrost, there was no permafrost, and the insects have changed, because I looked at why was there sudden disappearance of the Vikings, and studies have looked at the change in insects, and the insects that could survive the colder period of the onset of the Little Ice Age came larger numbers of them, so it would indicate that cold was the reason they all disappeared.
Absolutely. So that climate changes is not in doubt. The thing that is different now is the rate at which it's changing. It is changing so fast. Okay, so the pause is partly real and partly a statistical artifact. Okay, so the pause was described as... So here's my question to you, right? When did the pause start?
Well, different people have different opinions on that, don't they? Well, that's what most people say, don't they?
And the reason they say that is because it's the warmest year on record. So it's always going to be cooler after.
It's kind of a bit perverse to use the warmest year on record to suggest things aren't getting any warmer. So if somebody says to me, why hasn't it got...
the warmest year on record, really? I mean,
it's not anymore, but it was for a long time.
No, I mean globally, because, I mean, I don't know how old you are, but I remember 1976.
It was definitely warmer in 76.
I beg to differ. I mean,
okay, but
extraordinary.
No, but only where you were, right? That's a global temperature, right? So it might have been. I mean, I was 3 in 1976, so I can't. I don't have a personal experience with which to argue with you, but
if you look at the data, 98 definitely warmer than 76. Undoubtedly. As long as you may doubt the data, that's fine. But I think
regionally where I was,
if you believe it,
where I was, regionally it might be hot for you. Globally, 1998 definitely.
Okay. So the counter question to why is it not gotten any warmer since 1998 would be why has it got a lot warmer since 1992? And the reason I would pick... you've got to be careful.
Exactly. Artificially cooled it.
Exactly. But in 1998, El Nino artificially warmed it.
Oh, so there is a reason for
that,
other than CO2.
No, absolutely. El Nino.
Which has always happened.
So that's fine. It's a combination of El Nino and CO2. It's not just CO2. Okay. But people that don't like the idea of global warming have picked that year because it's exceptionally warm. And they can start at that year and they can draw a line that basically goes horizontally and say, well, there's been no warming since
I wouldn't. I'd rather go back to the ancient Egyptian times.
Absolutely.
And the Roman age.
Back that far.
Still use dendrochronology to the Roman age. And looking at achieving, we can establish it was warmer. That's why the Romans didn't wear many clothes and all their statues. And they were growing grapes in Yorkshire. And even in Europe, in Holland, there's lots of street names in the old medieval streets. They're all to do with growing vines, which is too cold to do now.
Absolutely. And so
it would indicate it's warmer.
So the fact that the climate changes is absolutely not a guarantee. It's how fast it's changing that's terrifying.
But it isn't really fast when we're still... You could argue on the scale of the cycles that we've established just now through talking, they're on scales of hundreds of years. Yeah, I mean, the medieval warm period was hundreds of years. Yeah. The Little Ice Age was hundreds of years. So, could we not assume that we're having a bounce back from the Little Ice Age? The cycles have been established before.
So I gave a talk to sixth formers yesterday about this, and what I did is I plotted the Milankovitch cycles. So Milankovitch is this guy that worked out why climate changes naturally, according to...
I'll tell you what, anything worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
It seems so complicated.
So he's an amazing guy. I mean, this is 100 years ago. So he dedicated his entire life to figuring this out. And he figured out that it's basically orbital mechanics. It's the way the Earth revolves around the Sun.
There's a wobble.
Exactly.
And that changes anyway. Precessional orbit changes over 26,000 years.
So you've got these wobbles. And if you plot something like oxygen isotope ratio back through time, you can see very, very clearly all of these cycles. So if you go forward and you plot these cycles, what happens is you plot them forward and you can predict exactly what's going to happen, and then right at the end it goes like that. Okay, and that's us. That's undoubtedly us. There's no other way to explain it.
I wonder how reliable those isotopes, the ice core samples, really are because I mean,
there's some error associated with them for sure. Backing a temperature and isotope data is dangerous and difficult, but you would have to explain to me why they match these predicted Milankovitch cycles so perfectly.
I have to talk to somebody called Murray Solvey. He would give an explanation. No, well, he worked in Australia. Yeah, he's an American.
So I taught him his book, actually. Yeah, so he's got a book on atmospheric physics, which I used as a postdoc in America when I was a postdoc in Michigan.
Well, I recently just watched a presentation of his, and he seemed to be using different isotopes of carbon to indicate that the CO2 might not necessarily be man-made. That using different isotopes like 13 or is it 12? I mean, I can't decide.
I've not seen the video, so I don't know.
I think it would be useful to have somebody of his calibre to actually attend a conference like this, to have a healthy skeptic to balance up what appears. Well, there seems to be a shortage of skeptics that are... there's different types of skeptics.
So maybe that's true, but I would say that, and I'll say this directly to the camera, right? I've been working in climate science for 4 years, I've never met such a bunch of egotistical wankers.
Really?
But they all agree, right? And
Are you referring to the climate scientists?
yeah, you could quote me on that.
I like this guy.
I like a lot of them a lot, but they are very, very strong-minded and very, very bright. But they all agree, right? You cannot get that sort of person to agree on anything. 98% of them have accepted the conventional wisdom on climate change. And if you really drill into it, objectively, I think it's very, very, very
ones
different.
working within the agenda of the climate change from that point of view, isn't it?
Okay. That is true.
But skeptics on your radar, particularly, are you? I mean, across those people.
I know who they are, but the idea that people are just working to an agenda because it suits them, I think is really not well-founded, right? If peers or me or anybody else could prove anthropogenic climate change was wrong, beyond doubt, we would be instantly famous.
Matthew, are you aware of a petition that was signed by 31,000 American scientists where they confirm on this petition that they believe global warming is a hoax?
I'm not aware of that.
And 8,000 of those scientists have PhDs. Yeah.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
So
I'll send it on to you, man. We can get your email address.
okay, you can have my email address. It's online. You can dig me out really easily.
Cheers, lovely, yeah, great.
One of my particular areas that I've been researching to sort of to get me concerned is the historical development of the military interest in weather and climate modification, which stretches back over 100 years. Well, the earliest reference to it I could find was in 1772, where the Bavarian Academy of Sciences offered a prize for the best scientific method to alter the weather. And then there's been a development for a long time. And it goes, some of the interesting ones are the use of electromagnetic energy to ionise clouds. Like there's a man called J.J. Thomson, who was the leader of the Royal Society. He said in 1910 at a symposium in Sheffield that it would only take a moderate amount of electrical energy to modify large regions of the atmosphere. By using ionisation, I believe. So I've been looking at this sort of long-term interest. At that time, they were actively talking about deliberately melting the Arctic for reasons of accessing resources, shipping lanes, accessing vast tracts of land. So this leading on, there seems to be a great deal of development from an interest from the highest levels, like from presidents of the USA like Eisenhower, JFK. JFK addressed the United Nations in 1961 saying that all nations would work together to accurately predict and eventually control the weather. That was continued by Lyndon Johnson, who was a particular fan of it. Then Nixon, and of course leads to the use of it for weapons with Popeye and everything else. Now the thing is, that brought on the NMOD treaty, but there are 42 nations with large-scale weather modification programs running, and that covers virtually the whole of the planet.
But that's not the same as climate modification, right?
No, I agree, but some of the papers and the symposiums in the 60s, mid-60s, from the National Science Foundation were specifically named the pursuit of weather and climate modification. So that, so this isn't that in their investigations wasn't just about weather modification, it is titled climate modification as well. So the thing is, with this large-scale weather modification, eventually, if you do it for long enough, like for example, there's many programs been running for over 50 years. Colorado, Texas, it's in the States, and of course it's in Australia, it's in Europe, it's in China. China boasted about the Beijing Olympics that would be fine, so they're obviously interacting with aerosols, they're affecting, they're desperate for their hydrological cycle to be confirmed all the time.
So the scientific community are not convinced any of that's actually working, right? So,
well, they had to do the NMOD treaty, so there must have been some that
but that's a preemptive strike against something. So I wouldn't assume that the NMOD treaty meant a lot of things were happening at the time. I mean, I don't disagree with you. There are undoubtedly weather modification programs, people seeding clouds. I think it's
very large scale. In fact, I've got a quote that, from 1967, and this is interesting actually, because the Soviets were working with the US, and in fact I can't remember, I think there's either 72 nations or more than that. I'm going to see if I can find it, that were working together for large-scale weather modification. It's called Worldwide Weather Watch, and it was in 1967. This is in the Atomic Bulletin, and they say that they had an office in Moscow, an office in Washington, they were building one in Melbourne, and with a view to large-scale weather modification. Right. So, at the highest levels, presidential level, at United Nations, they were in the 60s looking for weather and climate modification. Who's to say trust issues with governments? Sure. No. Even the British were doing Operation Cumulus, 1952. They were rainmaking. There's an incident in Lynmouth in Devon where do you know about that?
So I know about the Lynmouth flood. I've never managed to connect it to.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a brilliant BBC Radio 4 investigation. It's a half-an-hour radio show, obviously, Radio 4, and the guy does quite a good investigation and gets to talk to the pilots who they called it Operation Witch Doctor because they were rainmaking, and they talk about the loads they were using and they describe it. Well, I think aluminium sulfate is not. Aluminium was actually tested as a cloud seeding possibility to make crystals in 1944, but in that particular instance the idea is they might have been using silver iodide, but I don't know, because do you know what, I've looked into what you could use for cloud seeding and the list is huge. It's huge. So to know all the different experimentations over the years, I know that they were experimenting during the Second World War, only because I've come across documents for it, and so basically my point would be there is a motive for this. The motives would be for basically governments are kind of strongly influenced by corporations, international corporations now, and international corporations like, for example, Monsanto want to supply the world's food supply. They've openly stated that. It's not secret. So with sustainable development, there is a program called the bioeconomy. The bioeconomy is the sustainable food option where virtually all food will be GMO food. And so you can see now that there could be a motive that these corporations who have got privileges, like in America they have a Monsanto law to protect them from prosecution. That's a fact. So you could see well, if you could control the hydrological cycle through doing geoengineering, climate engineering, and if you were using different particles, like for example alumina or other particles, and they then, due to the research on acid rain and the effects of extra aluminium leaching into the soil because of the acid reacting, they now know that what the effects on the plants will be. So the plants get stunted roots and stuff like that as problems. So those problems can be overcome because there are aluminium-resistant crops now that Monsanto and DuPont and Syngenta and other bioscience corporations look to. It's basically 5 of them supply 90% of the world's seed. There's a massive corporate interest. If your motive is to control the world's food supply, because that's in your corporation's interest.
So that's quite an effort to join the dots, right?
Yeah, there's a lot more information.
But I guess so I heard David Keith say this, and I agree with him, which is I think when you're talking about chemtrails now, and I know you guys are totally committed to that idea.
I don't actually think of it more as contrails, and I'll tell you why. I've got a paper from 1970s. I've got a paper from 1970s in my bag over there, and this paper from 1970s is specifically talking about using contrails for weather modification. Right? And he says that the crystals from contrail cirrus that form, because where they are in the atmosphere, they they're good ice crystals. When they fall, they survive the fall. They can fall at great altitude, so they basically seed the clouds below. Now, if you think about the volume of air traffic now, that's a lot of contrails, and a lot of them are going over the Arctic region. Now, when I flew to San Francisco 3 weeks ago, we flew over Greenland. And I was thinking, I wonder how many flights go over Greenland. It's a lot. And you know, with the Gulf Stream blowing up particles and stuff like that. Well, it so happens that NOAA have done a study that there's been a 20-year linear increase in cloud cover in the Arctic region. Now, in this 1970s paper, he suggests that they're using contrails in order to geoengineer the Arctic region. In the 1970s. It was 1970s. Now, in the 60s, they openly talked about deliberately melting the Arctic region. That was a goal. And even in 1945, they suggested spraying carbon black to stop the reflectivity of the ice, so it would start to absorb the sun's heat, because they wanted to deliberately melt it. That's why from a guy called Vladimir Swadekin in 1945. He was working with John von Neumann from Princeton. And so, I know it's 1945. In 1965, they're still talking about it in the National Science Foundation in some of their papers. If in 1970 they're talking about the use of contrails or weather modification, and this guy from Alaska was concerned that they're doing this specifically to affect the climate region in the Arctic, what's to say that kind of that agenda hasn't, it's just gone quiet, it's changed.
So I accept the fact that planes have a profound effect on the atmosphere, and that there are a lot more planes. Okay, both of those I think are irrefutable. What I struggle with is this idea of some sort of shadowy organisation with deliberate control. So, funnily enough, apart from the intention, so the whole deliberate spraying thing just leaves me cold.
Let's give it up to uncomfortable.
But I just don't believe people would get away with it on the scale that you're talking about. Why are there no journalists? Why are there no politicians? Why are there no airline pilots? You know, you have to involve conspiracy theory that involves millions of people. Nobody from the Met Office, nobody from the NASA, nobody from NOAA.
NASA didn't even, the Met Office wouldn't even agree to the Lynmouth disaster. It took 50 years for that to come out. And, you know, as far as secrets, when Operation Popeye first became, it was suspected that we're using weather modification, and it went to Congress, when they were questioned, they denied everything. Okay? So they just, no, it's not happening. Do you know how many planes it took to do? Just 6 planes were used for Project Popeye. So I don't know what Project Popeye was a cloud seeding project that, first of all, was run by the CIA in 1963 from Thailand. And then later, it was actually taken on by the US. So secretly it was done by the CIA to start with, and then it was used later. But that's just an example of several examples of cloud seeding as a weapon in development, since they were using it in the Second World War. They might make mud. Extend the monsoon by 60 days. There's a guy called Livingstone, Ben Livingstone. He was one of the leaders of the Project Popeye. He's talked all about the success of his rainmaking exercise, which they always try to play down. And of course, then you got Project Storm Fury. It kind of leads me doing a tangent to a Walt Disney 1959, what they call a science factual documentary. Walt Disney worked with NASA and different government institutions to do a series of science factual things, and they did a program called The Eyes from Outer Space. It's really worth having a look at. In there, they talk about being able to use different weather modification techniques to steer a tornado. My link there was Ben Livingstone was also working on Project Storm Fury, which was about a 20-year-long program how to mitigate the strength of a tornado, of a hurricane. So in this eyes of outer space, they use rockets that explode just like they do in Beijing for cloud seeding. They used robotic aeroplanes to do cloud seeding, and in their thing it looks a lot like a chemtrail, or what we call a chemtrail, contrail, right? And we've got drones that can do that. There's a company that I've seen the jet drone drones will be used for weather modification. So that technology is proven. They talk about altering a high pressure bridge to create a block, which I believe now they call it an omega block, where basically you've got two low pressures and a high pressure, and that forms an omega shape, and that would stop the hurricane from making landfall. And the way they did that was by cloud seeding it in certain parts and building up the temperature of the clouds, because they were doing it with carbon black. Basically they were going through all the different proven and projected techniques that they would use to steer this hurricane and dissipate the power of it, take it out to sea, stop it from making landfall. Which of course is a great thing. But all the techniques back in 1959, if I wanted to, I could edit that out and say, well, all those things are here now. So who regulates all these private companies that are doing weather modification? There's a company now offering £100,000. For £100,000, I guarantee your wedding is a sunny day.
So, I mean, we're talking about weather and climate modification here because of the scale of weather modification. It's huge.
That never gets used in weather modelling and climate modelling. There's never anything about the potential effects of weather modification, because climate scientists say it doesn't work.
So I'm not expert enough to know whether it works or not. The conventional wisdom from the scientific community is the jury is still out. So the Chinese spend lots of money trying to do weather modification. It's not clear whether it works or not. This is from a non-expert perspective. Mm-hmm. But I still think it's an enormous stretch from that
to the idea that they might be doing something deliberately with the contrail generation to create clouds. Those types of clouds may affect the climate by acting as like a greenhouse effect with water vapour in the atmosphere, so clouds can block out heat, trap in heat. They can change the quality of the cloud so that it absorbs heat. And
I can absolutely see, in principle, how it can be done. I can absolutely, I'm not sure large corporations are universally evil, but I'm not a big fan, particularly of Big Ag, I have to say. I had my mind changed, actually. I recently went to a farm in Guatemala that's on the side of a volcano, and the farm was just bought out by Starbucks, which I thought would be appalling. Actually, and I know this for an absolute fact, and I don't drink at Starbucks, I don't have any shares in Starbucks, for the record. Mm-hmm. The workers are definitively better off now than they were before, because Starbucks have impinged all sorts of labour laws and environmental restrictions that the local landowners, who probably weren't as nice to their workers, never did. So even with that in mind, Monsanto...
not all corporations are bad.
Not all corporations are bad all the time. Mm-hmm. Right? Monsanto kind of give me the shivers, I have to say. Nestle, for example, as a student...
They want control of the water?
Yeah, but they also give powdered breast milk to babies. Yeah. So that large companies and governments can do shitty things in our name is without doubt, irrefutable. There's an example of the American government deliberately not treating syphilis in Guatemala to see what happens in the 1950s.
In the eugenics program.
Nevertheless, still don't see how they could get away with the sort of things that you propose on the scale you propose. Like regional control of weather or attempted control of weather, I don't doubt. Global spraying programs are the sorts of things you're talking about. I just don't.
How would they do it logistically? Like nano-encapsulated material?
No, I just mean I don't. Why
would they do that? What would be the motivation?
Well, so I sort of understand the motivation after having listened to Ian yesterday. What I don't understand is why, rabidly passionate environmental journalists. You know, not all politicians are evil. Why aren't these people coming out of the woodwork? So if I sat you down with somebody from Greenpeace,
Santilli,
David Santilli,
yeah. I want to talk to him.
And I said to David, is there a global spelling program? He'd say no. And what he would also say is that he thinks it's a conspiracy theory, and he's a very good guy, so he'd also say that, you know, I don't know whether you like the word chemtrailers or not, but it's
I don't like that word at all. I don't want to be labelled in that way, because I actually think this is what I'm talking about, contrails.
So what would we...
Okay, I would say, if I wanted to label myself, which I don't, I believe that the climate has natural variability, and I'm concerned that maybe the drive for CO2 is being exacerbated because there's another agenda which we can get into, which is about creating a carbon neutral society, which means a technological shift. And I've been looking at nanotechnology and bioscience and even neuroscience and information communications technology, and I see that sustainable development, or Horizon 2020, kind of linked to sustainable development in Europe, is it's about to have like a technological revolution that's going to rival the industrial revolution for the change it's going to bring to society. But I think society will only embrace that if they feel that there's a catalyst strong enough to make them do that. And I think that catalyst is the fear of global warming, the climate change issue being a threat to the planet. Therefore, global responses and global responsibility would mean that we want to change human behaviour or alter society to our new technology, to our new industrial revolution. So it's like society engineering. Okay. On that scale.
So I can envisage some problems with that. In as much as the power, I would argue, and I think you probably agree, currently rests with the people that will resist that. Okay? So I don't understand why you know, the terrifying faceless top of fossil fuel companies. Where's the power coming from in order to do that? Doesn't, you know? So maybe I've just bought into the rhetoric, you could argue, but these sort of greening technologies.
I'm not against all of the things that are being proposed. I think a lot of things are good.
But Mary was saying that she's completely electrified her house.
Couldn't we all do that? Couldn't every single house or building in cities?
Yeah, why not?
I'd love to counter the energy barons and let's all be self-sufficient and let's all be green and use renewable energy. It'd be wonderful. Why not? Because how much technology would it take to learn how to accelerate the electrolysis process for water in order that you could use hydrogen to drive your car? Instead of using hydrocarbons. You know, like that idea that literally you can just split water into hydrogen and oxygen, but do it in an accelerated way so that you don't need to store hydrogen, you use it on demand. So maybe you have a small tanks. Pardon?
But we still, I mean, is it
Okay.
you'll let us open back in?
We're going to have to cut this off now. Sorry, the mainstream TV are out there. All the activists are there. We got to go. Brilliant. That's
Okay.
really,
Well,
really
okay,
great
it's
interview.
fine.
Les. Great interview. Thanks a million for that, man.
You're welcome.
Gentlemen.